this seminar. My name is Dr. Jasmine Cooper. I am a steering committee member of the Imperial Lifecycle Network, and I will be chairing today's session. Today, the network is very proud to be able to present Dr. Andy Whiting of ERM Consulting, who will be giving his talk on the life cycle approaches in the pharmaceutical and healthcare sector. So before I hand over to Andy, just a very few quick words on housekeeping and a little bit of information on the network itself. Apologies if you hear any party noises from my end. My next door neighbors are making the most of the late March sunshine / heat wave. So they're having a barbecue right now. So apologies for any music or partying noises in the background. This session is going to be recorded, so please mute your microphones. And please turn off your camera so that we can save bandwidth, and so hopefully we can avoid any technical issues. There will be a Q&A that will be held at the end of the session, and if you do have any questions, please type those into the chat function in Microsoft Teams, and my colleague Paysan will read out your questions at the end. The recording of the session will be available after the seminar, and you should receive an email notifying you on how you can access both the recording as well as the slides for this presentation. So a little bit about the network. The Imperial Lifecycle Network is a network at Imperial that aims to bring together and connect lifecycle related research and researchers across Imperial, as well as connect its members to the wider lifecycle community. The purpose of the network is to foster collaborations and facilitate networking, as well as to share knowledge and contribute to advancements within the lifecycle field. For further information on the network, please visit our website or follow us on Twitter. And for anyone who is a lifecycle practitioner based in the UK, please consider joining the Lifecycle Community UK group in LinkedIn. Today's seminar is the fourth in the series of seminars hosted by the network, and all of our past seminars are available on our website. If you are interested, please visit imperial.ac.uk/lifecycle network/events, where you can access the live recordings or the slides used in these presentations. A note on our 2021 seminar series: these seminars will be held quarterly rather than monthly, and we have some very excited speakers lined up for our June, September, and December seminars. We will be announcing the speaker for our June seminar very shortly, so please do watch this space. Now on to the main event. This evening, the Lifecycle Network is very proud to be able to present Dr. Andy Whiting, who's a consultant at ERM Consulting, who will be giving his talk on lifecycle approaches in the pharmaceutical and healthcare sector. Andy joined ERM in 2014 and has project experience including LCA, carbon footprinting, carbon offsetting, scope 3, and avoided emissions. He has provided sustainability services to major clients in the healthcare and pharma sector, including a secondment to a ERM pharma client since 2015, which has given him great insights into the sustainability issues and drivers in this sector. He was a contributing author to ERM's Care Pathways, guidance on appraising sustainability developed for the Sustainable Healthcare Coalition. And with that, Andy, I'd like to hand over to you. The floor is all yours.
Great, thanks very much, Jasmine, for the introduction. I'll just see if I can get the screen sharing working. Can you just confirm that you can see my screen?
Yeah, I can see that.
Fantastic. So yeah, as Jasmine said, today I'll just be talking through my presentation on life cycle approaches in the pharmaceutical and healthcare sector. And thanks very much, everyone, for joining wherever you are in the world. So just a brief bit about me, just to introduce myself beyond what Jasmine's already said. Yeah, I have had a background in chemistry, but completed a doctorate in LCA and LCC of bioenergy in the UK. Studied at the University of Manchester for that. And I've not moved far. I've been a consultant at ERM since November 2014 in Manchester office, based in the product sustainability team, working on largely on life cycle assessments and carbon footprinting and aspects related to that. I've worked in many different sectors, but I'm increasingly focused on the pharmaceutical and healthcare sectors. And as previously mentioned, I'm seconded to AstraZeneca since 2015. I say seconded. Well, it's not that I was actually an AstraZeneca employee. It's just I sat within one of their sites one day a week back in pre-COVID times. Here I am also pictured pre-COVID times, back when haircuts were legal, and just to prove that this isn't a lockdown beard. I did have that before all this kicked off. So ERM, Environmental Resources Management, we're a global environmental sustainability consultancy with offices and 160 offices around the world. We work with clients in over 170 countries and territories, with 50% of the Fortune 500. Well, we work on helping clients to achieve their sustainability goals. And a bit of background on that. For our team in the pharmaceutical sector in particular, our team has been working with the Sustainable Healthcare Coalition for around a decade now. That's a coalition made up of the English National Health Service, Public Health England, various pharmaceutical companies, and ERM. And we come together to collaborate and share information on sustainability issues in the sector. And we've authored guidance that we've issued, for example, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol product standard for the pharmaceutical sector on products and medical devices, and also the care pathways guidance on appraising sustainability. And we have also helped the members to publish case studies in alignment with the guidance that we've published. So through this relationship, we've developed relationships with the individual members, working one-on-one with them, and also we've worked with non-member pharma companies as well. So just to touch on the main drivers for why companies in the pharma and healthcare sectors are increasingly interested in life cycle assessment. And it may be no surprise to you that it is the big issue of our time. It is climate change that's driving their interest. So it's coming under increasing scrutiny that the healthcare sector is a major contributor to national carbon footprints. Approximately 5.5% of national carbon footprints on average is from the healthcare sector. And there is a bit of a juxtaposition between the healthcare sector. Its raison d'etre is to help keep people healthy, and yet climate change is a health issue in itself. So there's a vicious cycle between climate change and health that the healthcare sector and pharmaceutical companies are very aware of. That said, it's not entirely. You'd be naive to think it's entirely altruistic. Thankfully, the individual people are certainly altruistic, but why are the companies really? What's the motive again behind that? It's the increasing scrutiny and pressure on healthcare services to meet government targets is a particular driver for this. So, for example, here in the UK, the English NHS aims to be carbon neutral by 2045, and it also has intermediate goals as well that need to be achieved. And one of the ones that's going to go in 2030 is that the plan is to not work with, not procure from companies that are less ambitious than the NHS's targets by 2030. And so that's not just for carbon neutrality or that's not just the targets for the things that so you can imagine that a company that sells to the NHS would be really interested in this, and if they're making the products that they sell to the NHS sustainable, it also drives other markets as well. So it really is kind of a rising tide pulling up all ships in that regard. And increasingly, because organizations such as the NHS is aware that a lot of their emissions arise from their scope 3 emissions, things like LCA results or carbon footprints are increasingly used in the procurement process, are going to be used in the procurement process increasingly. So, and that's the way that that things seem to be going. It's not very common yet, but that's the way the wind's blowing. And so companies are realizing that understanding the impact of their products and working towards reducing the impact of their products and quantifying it can in some cases give them a competitive advantage when it comes to procurement, and they can use it in marketing. Of course, LCA looks beyond just carbon, but the carbon footprint's what they're most interested in. But we try to push to the other impacts as well, so that we're not burden shifting between impacts. So as I previously said, the kind of announcements by the NHS and other organizations and countries as a whole has led to a swathe of announcements by pharmaceutical companies in recent couple of years. Some really ambitious announcements made last year and this year by pharmaceutical companies, many aiming for carbon neutrality in the 2030s, and in some cases their scope 1 and 2 emissions even sooner than that. So these companies need to understand what their impact is before they can start to reduce it, and so carbon footprinting and life cycle assessment allows them to make those reductions. So I'd like to take us through a very simplified life cycle of a pharmaceutical product. So it's very, very, very streamlined, but I was trying to capture as many products as I could within this that could fit. I want to talk through all of the as many hotspots as I can that I've seen, kind of patterns. I'm not going to claim that it's in any way an exhaustive list. And indeed, I don't cover. I'm not going to cover every impact either, but it's just some general trends from the work that we've been doing, where we see areas of concern, areas that concern pharmaceutical industry, and areas where they're going to have to really think about how they're going to make improvements to their products. So the simplified life cycle here starts with the active pharmaceutical ingredient. So this is the drug substance. This is what does the work in the patient's body. This is what reduces symptoms. This is what leads to cures. So that's the very first step. That's the most important ingredient going into your product. Followed by the excipients and formulation, so bulking up the product so that it's ready to be imbibed by the patient. So, for example, it's what else goes into a tablet, for example. Now, not all pharmaceutical products have devices, but I've listed it here because many do. And then there's packaging as well. So you've got to pack your product before it gets shipped and stored, and then used by the patient, and then the remaining device and packaging disposed of at end of life. And so I'll just talk through these life cycles and just highlight some areas of concern, starting with the API. So this is a significant contributor to quite a few different products, particularly essentially in places where particularly where there's a really let's just say there's not as much of a contribution. Well, not much of a contribution for the thing. That sounds really simple, actually. I'd say that way. But I'm thinking things like tablets and capsules. It makes up a larger proportion of the product compared to others, so it contributes quite high. There's a lot of variability in the impacts associated with an API. And there's many different ways of producing an API. So you get an organic small molecule, which sounds simple, but they can be relatively complex molecules. They're just not as complex as something like a protein, for example. But they generally can take quite a few steps to produce. At each step, there's many raw materials and solvents used, and at each step there's a yield. So there's a loss each time, which amplifies up the supply chain as you increase with a greater number of steps, amplifies the waste and resources required as you go up the supply chain. You get biologics that are produced in a very different way. It's more akin to brewing than your traditional organic small molecule. Produced in vats, you're growing a microbe that produces the API that you want, and then you're extracting through chromatography the API. And then there's also plant or animal-derived APIs, such as those produced for vaccines, egg-based vaccines. And the larger array of variation in production processes means there's a big range in greenhouse gas emissions per kilo. I've seen ones from still relatively high at 100 kilos per kilo, or up to, but then all the way up to tens of thousands of kilos, so to tens of tons per kilo. Although the one thing that needs to bear in mind is that these APIs are potent and used in small volumes. But even so, because of their high impact on a per kilo basis, they can dominate some life cycle. Sorry. sorry, I'm getting some feedback. Can everyone go on mute? Oh, thanks. So yeah, as previously mentioned, there's a lot of solvents used in organic small molecule production. So all that solvent has to be produced. It also generally is simply incinerated, and so that so we often find that solvents and incineration are big contributors to climate change impact. Catalysts, so many rare metals used there that often contribute to resource depletion if not recycled in great enough quantities. And finally, energy used in manufacturing contributes quite significantly, of course, depending on geography, but particularly to things like biologics and any area where they need to use a lot of HVAC and clean rooms and things like that, and a lot, and generally the longer that that it takes to make an API, the more energy needs to be used. So the more steps, the more energy. So potential solutions that we've seen explored. I mean, the first one and the most obvious one is to not waste what the API once it's there. It's taken a lot of effort to make it. There's a lot of embodied impact in the API, so it's good. It's best practice, of course, not to waste it, but goes without saying. But you'd be surprised how much does get wasted. For example, in the milling process to grind down an API to be so that it can be put into tablet form. You can, if you waste 30% of your API at that stage, then that's a significant increase in the impact of your API straight away because you've wasted all of that effort. Other solutions kind of grouped underneath green chemistry, so it's focusing on the reaction itself. It's all about energy and material efficiency, using less energy and less material. It's about recycling where possible your solvents and catalysts. So rather than incinerating solvents, can you reuse them? If solvents are going to be incinerated, can they be biosolvents? Can they be part of a carbon cycle instead of contributing fossil carbon when they're incinerated? And then also reducing the number of reaction steps, so maybe through novel routes of producing the API to make it a shorter route. Can you improve the yields at each step to reduce the waste when that amplifies up the supply chain? And finally, of course, use of renewable energy on sites that are producing the APIs has a significant has a significant reduction as well. So moving on to the excipients and the formulation. It typically does not contribute quite very high on many of the products that we assess. I know that if you imagine a tablet, the API makes up a very small proportion of that tablet. Most of it is bulked up with things like lactose and or capsules. It's the cellulose and gelatin and things like that. But ultimately, they're not as impactful as the API itself. So even though they make up a larger proportion, they don't impact as much as the API itself. There is one major exception to this rule from ones we've assessed is pressurized metered dose inhalers, or PMDIs. Now they contain F gases. They're not released at this stage in the life cycle, but during the production of those F gases, there are leakages and further up the supply chain, there are expected to be leakages, and anything involved with F gases, there's always a run risk of ozone depletion, resource depletion as well. Potential solutions here include capturing the fugitive F gases during production as best as possible, but that's really more of a short-term thing. Ideally, we're replacing the high global warming potential F gases with lower global warming potential alternatives, and failing that, it's a case of a transition to inhalers that don't require F gases, such as dry powder inhalers that don't need them at all. So avoiding the issue entirely. So I've grouped devices and packaging together here. They tend to have quite similar hotspots, but also in general nomenclature and the way people think about things at pharmaceutical companies, the device is often thought of as a type of packaging. If it's touching the drug substance, the drug product, then it's almost considered that the primary packaging, and then the box that goes around the device with the secondary packaging and so on. So yeah, in some ways, the devices are almost considered packaging in the pharmaceutical industry. They're just a functional piece of packaging that can help deliver the drugs to the patient. So again, issues here include energy use in assembly and any clean rooms that are required during production and sterilization. Again, with the PMDIs as the fugitive F gas emissions, because as you're producing a PMDI, you will need to test it, and so there's your normal leakages, but there's also inherently in the production process there is some emitted at this stage. And then for some of the other impact categories, ecotoxicity and resource depletion, large contributions from things like stainless steel parts, such as springs and needles, and from aluminium parts, such as blister pack foil, foil pouches, sachets, that sort of thing. And solutions again here, renewable energy, capturing fugitive F gases, and lightweighting, which sounds easy, but can actually come a crop of some regulatory difficulties, particularly the closer the packaging or device gets to the drug substance, the drug product itself, then it can be difficult to change the device or packaging format in some circumstances. And the same is true for using of recycled materials, particularly if it's in contact with the drug. There's issues surrounding materials of unknown origin and things like that. There are restrictions because of it's being used in a clinical setting, so there are some difficulties there. But even though they may offer a solution to some of these other sustainability issues. So distribution and storage, surprisingly little to say here. Typically, distribution doesn't tend to play that big a role. I'm talking here the distribution from gate to all the way to pharmacy or to a healthcare setting, unless air freight is involved. We don't typically see it contribute that much to the impacts we look at. There may be some contribution from things like storage, so refrigeration, but even at the ones that I've looked at, they've not been a very low temperature. I've not assessed ones like, for example, to be topical, the Pfizer vaccine that needs to be at a very, very low temperature. So I wouldn't be able to speak for something like that. But yeah, typically at this stage, it's mainly the if there's air freight included, that should be, if possible, replaced with sea or rail freight. And on the use phase, a few aspects here. Just one thing to point out here is that not everyone agrees that patient travel is in the use phase. Sometimes I've seen it listed in the distribution phase instead, and I get the point in terms of a person going to collect something at a pharmacy, for example, and return. But there is a complication there with if someone's driving, say, to go to a GP to have something administered, it would almost be like the journey to the GP is part of the distribution, but then once they've used it, then the return journey is almost part of the use phase. So yeah, it can be confusing as to which life cycle phase that actually fits under. But for now, to put it into the use phase, that tends to be where we put it. And it is surprisingly significant, and it's not something often that our clients want to hear, and I think that's largely down to maybe the feeling that it's not something they have a lot of control over, and also the inherent uncertainty around it. So how far do people travel? How do they travel? Are they traveling just to pick up a prescription, or is it part of a journey to, I don't know, to the supermarket or something like that? And there's a pharmacy at the supermarket, so you'd have to allocate the impact of patient travel across all things bought in the journey. So there's a lot of uncertainty there. And they don't feel like there's much control, but I will talk through a couple of solutions in a sec. Yeah, so there's also delivery of the prescription to patient as well. If someone's not going to collect it from a pharmacy, then they might get it delivered. And other issues that arise at the use stage include the aforementioned, again, PMDIs. They keep appearing, don't they? This is where most of that F gas actually is released. So this is the big one for the PMDIs. It's largely released during the use phase. And the same is true for some of the gaseous anesthetics that have high global warming potentials as well. Just to go through some of the solutions, as I said, the companies don't think they have that much that they can do around patient travel. One of the big ones is simply multi-packs. If you pack 3 things together, and so long as they'll stay in date within the time frame, then if you pack 3 things instead of 1, that's a third of the patient travel requirements to go to the pharmacy to collect. So there are some very simple things like that. What we've seen from some of the assessments that we've done, where we have made assumptions around how far people would travel and how they travel, we've seen that delivery tends to be lower than your average patient travel to a pharmacy. So potentially encouraging delivery would overall be a net benefit. I put this one here. It's not really something that pharmaceutical companies have control over, but it's maybe just to say that as it's kind of outside this, something outside of the sphere of influence is the move to e-mobility, that maybe patient travel itself would, at least in geographies where that starts to become more prevalent, maybe it'll become less of an issue over time without too much. Without too much effort from the pharmaceutical companies themselves. It'll still take a lot of effort from, but it's in other people's hands almost. And then for the two other products down there, so yeah, the main one here is to capture the anesthetic gas. So when it's being used, there are some limits on exactly how much you can capture, and indeed, actually, even the patient does obviously absorb some of it, and then is actually released after the operation. So there's some that just will never be captured. So again, it's all about the replacing the high impact gases with low, and looking to potentially, if that's not possible, because there are issues there. Companies have lined up a few potential gases to switch to that have much lower GWPs, just to put it in your mind. So what some of the worst ones that are used in inhalers have around 3,000 kilos per kilo GWP. And some of the I say better ones are 1,500, but there are prototype ones that have as low as 150, and some that are even lower than CO2. So essentially negligible compared to the alternatives. The only problem there is that, of course, it's not that they're just replacing a refrigerant or something like that has to go through its own safety tests. But when something's actually being breathed into the lungs, you can imagine that there's a lot of clinical trials that need to be undertaken to make sure that that these gases are safe and that can be used as a direct replacement for the old gases. So yeah, a lot of companies that produce PMDIs really need to transition, and they are aware of that, because if they don't, organizations such as the NHS see PMDIs as a low-hanging fruit, essentially, and it's something that they can get rid of in the short term by replacing with clinically equivalent dry powder inhalers or other inhaler designs and other treatment options, such as even biologics, to reduce requirement for any PMDIs. So that's a real threat to PMDI producers that they need to act on. I guess the same is probably true also for gaseous anesthetic producers, with competition from intravenous anesthetics, that if they could be used in a clinically equivalent way, then maybe surgeons would be anesthetists will be minded to use them instead of gaseous anesthetics, or be advised to, at the very least. And finally, end of life. There they are again. Any of the F-gas that isn't released during the use phase, or indeed if an inhaler reaches the end of its life without even being used, then all that gas will be released, or a large chunk of it can be released at end of life, particularly if it's disposed of to landfill or inappropriately. From the research from the literature we've studied, we believe that most of the F-gas is destroyed can be destroyed if it's sent to incineration. And in fact, if you return an inhaler to a pharmacist, then it's going to hazardous waste incineration. So take-back schemes are a potential option there for destroying at least the remaining gas in inhalers after use, which can reduce it slightly. But if most of it's released during the use phase, it's only a small-term gain. So rather than repeat myself on the PMDIs, I'll move on to the other, which is incineration. So lots of plastic in medical devices. Ultimately, a large chunk of medical waste, maybe more so that's thrown away in, say, hospitals or at GPs or in pharmacies, is sent to hazardous waste incineration. There's also a certain amount of consumer waste that will end up going to incineration, particularly as people move, as countries move away from sending things to landfill. So incineration can be a particular problem. So solutions include looking to increase recyclability of devices and packaging. So some things are pretty much already recyclable, such as the boxes and leaflets, but there's much more difficult to recycle aspects such as, say, blister packs, and then the medical devices themselves, particularly things like inhalers and auto injectors that tend to be made from many different types of plastics and materials. It's a very challenging thing to recycle. And finally, if things are going to be incinerated, then maybe investigating what the impact would be of using bioplastics as a potential solution to, or potential reduction could be achieved through that. Okay, so after going through all those hotspots, I just wanted to go through some challenges. Now, not all of these are actually specific to the pharma sector, and in fact, you may face quite a lot of these in your own work as well. So I just I guess it's an airing of frustrations that you can sometimes have in the life as a life cycle practitioner. And the one I'm starting with is data collection, which is always, I feel, one of the biggest challenges when performing a life cycle assessment. So when I'm working with a client, particularly early on when they've not done it before, it's a very difficult process. It does get better as life cycle thinking is starting to become more common once they've built up some resource within the team that understands the process as well, and you start to build up a network of people who you can contact for particular pieces of information. Oh, this is where we got it last time. We'll contact the same person this time. So there's the first time was the most difficult. It's getting easier, and I think it's probably only going to get easier as well with the way that things are going. At least from what I see in the pharmaceutical industry, it's going to get easier as this kind of thinking is embedded in the process. But yeah, things that are particularly complicated in the pharmaceutical industry is the complex supply chains, particularly for some of the APIs, the number of raw materials that go in, and also a lot of companies outsource. There's a lot of outsourcing as well. So the company may not even produce the API itself; it outsources it to another company. So you've got a kind of an extra barrier between you and the data itself of trying to get a supplier on board, and actually that is also over time slowly getting easier. Because the more the question is asked, the more the companies are prepared for it. And in fact, this is very rare, but even one occasion, a supplier had already done a life cycle assessment and so was able to provide us with over the full LCI. It was the best day ever, but but that was a very rare event. But they're increasingly open to the idea of sharing information, but then as listed at the bottom here, there's then confidentiality issues to iron out, and can sometimes be a bit of a delay to your program because you're having to get contracts signed 3 ways between the companies and to make sure that confidentiality is respected. Other issues include characterizing complicated starting materials. So you try and go as far up as you can in the step chain of, let's say, an API manufacturing process until you can maybe get to some chemicals that might already be included in life cycle inventory databases such as EcoInvent, for example. That's not always possible. Sometimes you'll have to rely on things like patents to be able to get back to as simple chemicals as you can, but you've got to draw the line somewhere eventually. And generally, the more steps you include, the more the worse it gets, which is a bit. It doesn't encourage the company to do the extra legwork. Really, if the more effort they put into it, the worse it gets because the more steps they've gone up, and actually that because of the yield losses that increases the impact. So yeah, that can be a challenge. Another one is allocating utilities. You can imagine a very big pharmaceutical site. It produces many different types of products. The way that they keep track of their energy, electricity, and heat is largely on a site basis. If you look, you might be building, but a building can make many different things. How you go about the easiest way is usually top down, but that has its challenges, and so sometimes it requires going from more of a bottom up approach and thinking about what equipment is on, how long it's on for, and that's a much more difficult process, and finding the right person to be able to answer those questions is also quite a challenge, and for them not to get bogged down in too much detail. Sometimes you're just looking to fill the data gap, and even you might think it doesn't actually contribute that much in some cases. Maybe, for example, in a geography that has a lot of hydropower, although that would contribute to freshwater use. But yeah, if from a carbon perspective, sometimes it'd be a bit frustrating when people focus on too much detail. And I think I've covered patient travel enough really in the previous one, so I won't labour the point. I'll move on to pharmaceuticals in the environment. So some of you may, if you're more familiar with the sector, when you saw my use phase and end of life, it may have been jumping out to you, where's the pharmaceuticals going and things like that, and that is true. So it doesn't obviously tend to apply to something like a carbon footprint, but where you're looking at some toxicity impacts, you can start thinking about what if the pharmaceutical itself, the drug substance, ends up in the environment, be that through poor waste management, for example. The difficulty there is the fact that these are complicated, bespoke chemicals that don't exist in any databases. The hoops you have to jump through to get kind of a characterization factor for these chemicals it's quite challenging. It's something we tried a while ago, but found it very, very difficult, so it's not something we've approached often, but we do have it in the back of our heads that LCA isn't capturing this very well in terms of contrasting or contextualizing that potential impact against other toxicity related impacts in the supply chain, such as mining and things like that. Where does it actually fit in? Other challenges associated with it include that you're not just thinking about the drug substance in the environment itself, but there's also, once a patient has taken the drug substance, they'll metabolize it, and that can metabolize into many other chemicals, and they can end up in the environment as well. So what's the impact of those, and how much actually does end up in the environment ultimately? How do you go about estimating that? It's an entire field in itself, and there are answers to those questions. It's just how that fits in to LCA, that's still a bit in the very early days. I'd say it's not very well covered so far. And another thing that's not very well covered, if we move on to the next point, is I believe is single-use plastics. Very, very, very topical. And of course, you can do a life cycle assessment comparing something that uses a lot of single-use plastics against something that doesn't. But in terms of amount of single-use plastics, it's often a bit counterintuitive. Sometimes you can get something that uses a lot of single-use plastics, but is better for has a better carbon footprint, for example, and our clients find that sometimes difficult to wrap their head around because they don't want to move to use single-use plastic because single-use plastic equals bad. That's what's in the news all the time. But and I guess when you're thinking from a carbon perspective, you can maybe make that case. So okay, so the carbon footprint is better, but then they're thinking more in terms of plastic in the ocean and choking animals and things like that, and that's not something that's really captured in an LCA beyond maybe a simple sum of saying this is the amount of plastic, so there's a potential for more release. And I guess the main issue from a pharmaceutical sector and healthcare perspective would be that they do use a lot of single-use plastics. But as I said before, when it comes to medical waste, particularly at least in developed nations or at least nations that have the waste management system infrastructure all in place, it's typically incinerated anyway, so it's not ending up in the sea, unless maybe so it's more consumer side of products such as blister packs and devices that end up in patient hands that have more of the potential to be, say, littered or disposed of in an inappropriate manner. But how to quantify that and how to contextualize the impact of plastics in the environment just sat there being plastics, and how does that compare to other maybe toxicity impacts? That's not something we've incorporated. Yeah, I know that although I am aware of movements to try and maybe make a single-use plastic impact category, and I'm keeping an eye on that because I think that would be something that clients would value, so that they can really see what the impact is potentially of the single-use plastic aspects of the life cycle. The one I touched on briefly, and that's the regulations that stifle innovations for products that are already on the market. So to try and make a change to a design, maybe if it's something just like the box around it or the leaflet and things, then that's relatively easy. It's the things that touch the product, because when the more involved something is in the delivery of the product, the more there are questions around, well, does this affect the efficacy of the drug itself? We need to do more studies and clinical trials, which is fair enough, but it makes it very difficult once it's on the market to make these changes. And what that says to me is that life cycle assessment should be done earlier on in the product development stage. Right now, in the last few years or so, companies are getting acquainted with LCA, and so they're wanting to do all of their on-market products, but they need to embed it within their design processes. They need to think about it before they get to that stage, so that they can make the changes before they or at the clinical trial stage, so that they don't have to make changes later. One final one here was just about messaging, really, and I don't know if anyone else has come across it, but in terms of things like carbon footprints, it tends to be a lot easier for people to visualize the impacts that that particular impact, maybe because it's in the news all the time. When it comes to something like, say, cancer toxicity, there's a real messaging issue there when you rock up with a graph showing a client that how much their product contributes to something called cancer toxicity. Particularly when you speak to the marketing team, my God, the alarm bells go off, and they imagine all the tabloid headlines and things like that, I guess. So there's an issue with messaging there that I've yet to think exactly how best to approach. Like to hear many people's opinions on that, but even through things like weighting and normalization and showing how much it is compared to some, because life cycle practitioners like us know that everything has a cancer toxicity the same way as everything has a carbon footprint. It's just another metric. It's difficult to get that message across sometimes. So I guess that's the first half of this talk, was mainly focusing on the drivers and the hotspots and the challenges. And I just wanted to sign off with a couple of case studies from some of the companies that we've worked with. So the first one I wanted to go through is a case study from a carbon footprint that we did for Novartis. So it's back to the inhalers again. And as I mentioned, PMDIs contribute really a lot to global climate change. 3% of the English NHS's carbon footprint, for example, which is why they see it as a low-hanging fruit to just replace with alternatives and get that clean up straight away. And so Novartis are one of those companies that is jumping at the bit to replace PMDIs with their own designs. And so one of their inhalers is called the Breezehaler. So main advantage, no HFA used. But an additional aspect that's not true of all dry powder inhalers is that it's a refillable device as well. So you put in a capsule, and for each inhalation, you put in a capsule, and then you dispose of the old capsule. It's mainly made from plastic, as opposed to a PMDI that has a large aluminium canister associated with it. And for this particular device, there is an optional digital companion that can attach onto the inhaler, and then has an app associated with it that you can that can track patient use of the inhaler, which is as you can imagine, it's particularly useful for pediatric and maybe older patients that might have memory issues, and so the app can remind them to take their inhaler. Just to be clear, this is an inhaler that you use once a day. It's one that's more to prevent exacerbations from occurring, rather than one that you take as a rescue inhaler when you feel an attack coming on. So Novartis wanted to examine the carbon footprint benefits of this technology compared to other devices where there was information available in the literature, and so the potential advantages of this was for its use in marketing and to promote sales. Low impact products are easier to market in this new environmentally conscious world. They provide a competitive advantage over similar products with higher impacts, and here's the big thing, and the thing that's becoming more common, is that they see it as a way of winning large procurement contracts with healthcare providers. It's an additional arrow in the quiver. Is that the right term? So it's an additional thing to promote their product to their customers. I mean, it's not just that as well. Of course, there's the insight into the environmental hotspots, showing where in the product design that they'll be able to make it further improvements to their product and further reduce the impact. So a slightly more complicated life cycle diagram, but just to show there's three potential APIs. There's two formats of this Breezehaler product: one that uses 2 APIs, one that uses 3. 2 of them produced on site, and we approached one of the first barriers, where one of them is used by a supplier, and the supplier wasn't willing to part with any information. So there's already a barrier there, but we can make do. So then we've got the capsule production. So those are the capsules that you put in once a day. The API is produced and then formulated into capsules, and then the capsules are sold in blister packs. So they're packaged. The inhaler is produced at another site in Italy. They're all packed in Spain. And then there's also, and we did also assess the optional digital companion that's produced at another supply site, all confidential. We're not allowed to name them and everything. So once fully packed, transported to 4 different markets that we assessed that were of main interest to Novartis, as that's where they were releasing the new product this year. One thing you'll notice here, not in scope, patient travel. We weren't able to convince them to include it. And to be fair, from all the things we look in the literature of inhalers, carbon footprints of inhalers in the literature, it's not generally included. So they feel like if they're the only ones to include it, then they're putting themselves at a disadvantage. And we did include it as a sensitivity analysis to show what the contribution was compared to the impact of the device, but yeah, it's I think it's getting easier to convince them to include it, or at the very least show a carbon footprint with and without. But I guess the difficulty is how do you define it, and you compare, how do you compare with other products if you've decided on different distances, for example, in different modes. So yeah, then we've got use phase and end of life. Yeah, okay.
Andy, it's nearly 20 past, so if you could wrap up in the next 5 minutes, that would be great, so we have time for questions at the end.
Sure, I'll try and speed up a little bit then. So, so headline results then. So it's there's no one major contributor to these impacts. It's quite evenly split between the API and the inhaler raw materials production of the inhaler itself and some of the packaging. The one that's the highest is the one with the sensor, and so obviously adding a sensor on it increases the impact of the device itself by a certain amount. The one that was lowest here is actually a version of the device that can be used across 90 days rather than 30 days. So you keep the same inhaler, you just get more blister packs. And so this is showing a month's use of the inhaler. You can see that makes a big saving because you only need a third of inhaler and a third of the energy that went into making it, and a reduced amount of packaging. So yeah, there's a big advantage that can be seen there. We did a literature review of carbon footprints of inhalers in the literature. So we can see that highlighted on the left are Novartis's Breezhaler devices, coming out obviously significantly lower than the PMDIs on the right, and in some cases quite a bit lower than the other DPIs assessed, but of course when it's closer and there's uncertainties in exactly what's included in scope, so this is illustrative that there is a case for the Novartis inhaler to be lower even than competitor DPIs, but certainly lower than the PMDIs and even lower than than one that's a novel version using a new form of low impact gas. There's a publication timeline here. The carbon footprint led to a further life cycle assessment that's not yet in the public domain, as well as a meta-analysis of what is in the literature that we'll be releasing in due course, and also a study into the impacts of asthma exacerbation that I'm really excited to share eventually once that goes into the public domain. I think that should happen in the next couple of months, so we're a little bit too early for me to go into that in detail. I will be presenting at various conferences as well in the coming year. And one thing that I just wanted to touch on, because I thought that the exacerbation study was particularly interesting, but unfortunately I'm not allowed to share the information about Novartis particularly, but we have done a very similar assessment. In this case, we're just, so we're just a little bit of background to show that, and this graph surprised me, to show that people in the healthcare sector don't think, as much as other sectors, that their products have a positive greenhouse gas impact, which to me was surprising given the obvious social benefit that healthcare products have. Surely there could be an environmental benefit as well from taking your medicine and things like that. So this links into with the care pathways guidance that ERM developed with the Sustainable Healthcare Coalition, where we provided guidance on assessing the carbon, water, and waste impacts of care pathways by breaking down a care pathway into various modules that are kind of the building blocks of a care pathway. So someone goes to a GP, or they go into an emergency department, they undergo surgery, they travel, or they stay in a hospital bed. So it's creating a building block of almost like processes to build up a care pathway. Using this, you can then compare a good care pathway with a poorly controlled care pathway against a better controlled care pathway, for example, where you've improved adherence to medication, which reduces exacerbations and thus fewer emergency admissions, fewer surgical interventions, etc. So there's a potential carbon saving here. So this is just to illustrate the concept. We decided to apply this to a different inhaler device form, but this is another optional digital companion that goes alongside an inhaler, and again, just tracking, making sure that they're using it on time. I won't go into too much detail. It's produced by Aderium, and it combines with AstraZeneca's Symbicort Turbuhaler. And for the function, we looked at the annual management of a child with asthma aged 6 to 16 years old in the UK, taking regular inhaled steroids with poorly controlled asthma. And then just, so we assessed a care pathway with that in mind, and then a care pathway with improved adherence because of the device that they have that reminds them to take their medication, and thus reduces exacerbations. The results include a significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, water consumption, and waste. You can see that the very light blue part of the bar is increases as you go to the right, because there's an additional device that increases the impact. However, that's completely offset when you take a step further back and look at what actually is happening here in the care pathway. We're reducing the impact overall across the care pathway. And yeah, that's just a summary of the previous one. So I'm happy to just move on to questions now. Thank you very much. Sorry if the end was a bit rushed there. Didn't realize the time.
That's great. Thank you, Andy. Paysan, would you like to go through the questions?
Okay, thank you so much, Andy. Would you mind staying for maybe a little longer, maybe for 10 minutes, because we have quite a number of questions here.
Yep, that's fine.
Yeah, so the first question from Niels, asking is global warming the most important environmental impact in pharmaceutical industry?
Yes, it's a short answer to that. It's certainly the main driver. It's what a lot of the regulations are based on. It's what the targets are set towards. It's something that everyone's very aware of, and with the ambitious targets that they've set and the really quite short timeframes that they've given themselves to achieve. So just this one, almost a decade of action, really, from 2020 to 2030. I'm not tricking myself into thinking that won't require at least some offsetting. But yes, climate change is the biggest one that they think of. There are some other driver issues that maybe I didn't go into, such as the circularity issues and around resource use and increasing their recyclability, but they are kind of interwoven with climate change sometimes as well. But yeah, that's maybe another driver to think of as well.
Okay, thank you for that. For the second question from Antonio, are there environmental impact assessment methodologies specifically developed for pharmaceutical products?
There's not ones developed specifically for. In the past we've used just typically ILCD, and we are keeping an eye on maybe the transition to EF 3.0, particularly for the EU once that becomes fully active. But in terms of the impacts that our clients are interested in, we don't usually include all of the impacts that we could. I know this can be up to 18 different impacts in some cases, and sometimes it just muddies the water a little bit, and people lose focus when they see a graph with that many impacts in, and you start to wonder, okay, which one do we focus on first? So often we reduce to what the client is particularly interested in, which obviously includes climate change, but we try and expand it out to others. They're often interested in things like fresh water use, ecotoxicity, resource depletion, and sometimes ozone depletion, and also although actually we do develop some kind of custom metrics that our clients are interested in, but they're not standardized outside of ERM. It's more just a case of there's the what's known as the PMI, or product mass intensity, that they're particularly interested in particularly in the API side of the life cycle, where they're interested in how much resources do we put in. It's in some cases been used as a kind of a proxy for carbon emissions, because they're quite closely correlated. So yeah, so we sometimes report to that as well. because it aligns with some of the other tools that they use to track sustainability.
Okay, and another question from Antonio. Are there any product category rules aimed for pharmaceutical products? Probably not all types, but if they are, for which types of products?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, there's been movement all the way since 2012 when it wasn't such a product category because it didn't apply for whole LCA, but it was for carbon footprinting. There was the greenhouse gas protocol. For product sector guidance that ERM was involved in, and that was back in 2012. More recently, there have been movements to create PCRs, but then it's come across the same issue that always happens when people start to make standards. Many people try at the same time, and you wonder which one you should use. But I know that that there's certainly one in the later stages of development at the TU Berlin. That I've seen the draft of, and there's also one that we're quite aware of with me working for AstraZeneca that's being developed in Sweden for is it Leaf or IVL or something like that. I'm trying to remember the name, but there's certainly one in production there as well. We're aware of it because they've been contacting pharmaceutical clients for input, which is great because they need input from the people who are going to, because the people are going to be using the guidance, of course, and yeah, some further standardization is always helpful, particularly in areas maybe where maybe with areas like patient travel, maybe we can agree on a standard amount that has a standard distance, a standard mode, although it does vary by geography and it will change over time. But at least it'll iron out a few things, streamline things a little bit, worry less about the uncertainty, and also, of course, facilitate comparisons between different people doing assessments of similar products, but you want to make sure that they're including the same things, and that when they're making methodological choices, that they're consistent. So to make the comparison fair, and that is something that companies in our sector are concerned about, and it's why they're sometimes very hesitant to release things to the public domain. I do think that's changing. They're getting more in confidence, but you still have people more confident to release it if they think that theirs is the lowest as well. So people with the highest aren't going to release their information if they think that they might be higher. And also if they think that maybe it'd be too easy to manipulate a good answer by excluding something like patient travel, for example. So yeah, there's some things to be ironed out, and there are some PCRs that I have seen that are in development.
And another follow-up questions from Antonio. When performing an LCA study of pharmaceutical products, many times the inventory of many compounds is not known and has to be evaluated. Which methodology do you recommend to access it?
There's not necessarily a particular method that we use, but I mean, we look in the literature for the best available, say, routes, and those can often be in patents. We can see if someone has done a life cycle assessment of that particular product. In terms of creating our own proxy for it, either at best we get an exact match in something like EcoInvent, or we find a proxy of some similar compound that might be made in a similar way. We can read into how that molecule is produced and approximate it using the raw materials that go into it, and then adding a little bit to account for, say, the energy and yield losses and things like that based on other things that we've assessed. And then, of course, the amount of effort that we'll go into, of course, that also depends on exactly how much we think it's going to contribute to overall. We don't want to put too much effort into something that's not actually going to be contributing that much. But so there are many different ways to face it. But yeah, you go from one extreme to the other, and if each one isn't apparent, then you move on to the next until you eventually get, and then your accuracy goes down, of course, with each step. But hopefully you hope that isn't an issue. Depends on it's always best to run a bit of a sensitivity beforehand, just to see, is this going to even be a big contributor or not? Is this a chemical compound of concern? Has anyone else raised issues around this chemical? Asking questions about that before diving headlong into it.
A question from Niels: what hinders the recycling of pharma products?
Hinders. There's a lot of well, of course, there's when you've got something that's clinical waste, a lot of people don't want to touch it at all. It just gets thrown in the incinerator, particularly in places like hospitals. You can imagine syringes and things that are biological waste. There's a lot of issues there. Maybe in the more consumer stuff, there's maybe a bit less of an issue. But the main issue then is all the different materials that go into it. How do you take apart something like a device? Into its respective materials so that they can be isolated and recycled. That's a big challenge. There are companies out there that offer things. We investigated something with we're quite famous company called TerraCycle, who offer almost to recycle anything you can think of. They seem to have a recycling scheme for, and there have been take back schemes with inhalers to them, particularly the ones with gases in them, because you capture the remaining gas, then you can maybe make a saving. But as far as but yeah, there are big challenges with being able to take them apart and into the right. So the best things to do is to reduce the number of materials you can make it out of one material, potentially. That's easier said than done. But yeah, to make something as easy to recycle as maybe something like a plastic bottle, it's a challenge.
A question from Ethan: how much of a difference, if any, in environmental impact metrics such as global warming potential is observed between pharma products as manufactured by their original developer and process versus generic competition produced after their initial patents end?
That's a really interesting question. Yeah, because most of the work that we do is with the people who still have the intellectual rights to it, or although we have access to some things that they still make but have left. But and those big companies tend to have the more resources available to perform these kind of assessments, and so that's something that I've not personally worked with a generics manufacturer yet, but it would be something very interesting to look into, particularly as ones. I know they tend to be a lot smaller. They might be less concerned. This might be a generalization. They might be less concerned as the bigger companies about it. They're less well known and they're less public facing. And also you get companies like AstraZeneca, GSK. A lot of the later stages at the least that are occurring in geographies such as Europe, like in Sweden or in Switzerland for Novartis, where there's a lot of hydropower being used, whether generics are more likely to be based in India or China, where there's more coal, or any geography where there's more coal use. I'm not sure, so that I'm just speculating in there. But yeah, I'd be very interested to see research into that, whether there's a big difference between the two. I mean, it's one thing that organizations like the NHS often run into when it comes to pricing, of course, that if they're using input-output factors, that when something goes off patent and suddenly reduces in price, that the impact of it hasn't necessarily fallen. It's just the amount of money you're spending on it. So yeah, which is another reason why they should be doing the life cycle assessment and seeing the real impact of a product rather than an estimation. Or a rough estimation.
Paysan, I think this is going to have to be the last question because we are running quite a bit over time.
Okay, all right. So a last question from Maria. Ideally, would the fate of pharmaceutical traces that may be still present and discharged after wastewater treatment, including the impacts of emerging contaminants, antimicrobial resistance, etc., be assessed under the life cycle of the pharmaceutical product itself, or would that impact be assessed as a wastewater treatment process impact?
I've seen it typically included in the use phase, actually, where it's been metabolized and say it goes into the wastewater treatment system rather than end of life. But then I guess it's probably difficult to say exactly which life cycle stage it would be included in, if it could be incorporated into LCA. As I mentioned before, there are difficulties associated with doing it in the first place. I'd have to refer to some of the PCRs in draft to see where they've put it. But I think I recall seeing a metabolized one ending up in use phase, but of course, if it's something being disposed of, like just a pack of tablets that's gone out of date, then that will probably go into the end of life phase.
Okay, great. Thanks, Andy. Thank you for everyone for attending. Just to repeat, this seminar has been recorded and it will be made available shortly after later today, either later today or maybe tomorrow. you'll get an email notification for how to access both the recording as well as the slides that Andy has very kindly agreed to share. Apologies to anyone who didn't get to have their question read out. Sometimes these things happen. Thank you.
It's probably my fault. Just been going on too long. I want to say a big thank you to everyone for joining. And yeah, and big apologies if I don't manage to answer your question. If I haven't, and you want to send it to me an email from them, please do. Send me an email, and I'll try and get back to you.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks. Thank you, Andy. Thanks everyone, and have a good evening. Great. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks everybody. Bye.